Chapter 1, The 100th Year of Lies. The crystal chandelier above the ballroom of the Sterling estate didn't just sparkle, it hummed with the weight of a century of deception. 100 years of Arthur Sterling. 100 years of refined, calculated, and perfectly curated lies. "Elena, darling, you look as though you're waiting for the firing squad," my husband, Julian, whispered. He tightened his grip on my waist, his fingers digging into the silk of my gown with a familiarity that felt, for the first time tonight, like a leash. I forced a smile, the kind that didn't reach my eyes, the kind taught to every girl born into this family. "It's just the champagne, Julian. It's too vintage." My head is swimming. Across the room, the birthday boy sat on his velvet throne, a frail king surrounded by golden sycophants. Arthur Sterling, my grandfather. The man who had built this dynasty on real estate and iron-fisted influence. The man who had raised me in the shadow of his towering ego. The music swelled, a jazz trio playing standards that felt like a funeral march. I excused myself, needing air, needing to escape the suffocating scent of expensive lilies and desperation. I slipped toward the heavy oak doors of the private banquet wing, looking for the catering staff to ask for water. Julian followed. He didn't say a word, just matched my stride. When we reached the private lounge, he didn't stop. He pushed me inside and slammed the door shut, a heavy, final sound that echoed off the mahogany paneling. "Something is off," he said, his voice stripped of its usual social polish. He wasn't looking at the door, he was looking at his watch. "Julian? What are you doing?" "The guests." "Forget the guests." He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. It was crumpled, the seal already broken. "I told you I was handling the archival restoration for the family trust, didn't I?" "Yes, of course, but..." "I found a file, Elena. Buried in the vault records from 1926. Things don't add up." He shoved the papers into my chest. "Read it." I looked down. My hands, usually so steady when repairing the delicate gears of an antique clock, began to tremble. I pulled out the document. It was a genetic analysis report, dated 3 weeks ago. My name was at the top. And below it, the lineage breakdown. My eyes scanned the lines, looking for the familiar markers of the Sterling bloodline. They weren't there. The markers for the man I called grandfather were absent. I looked up at Julian, my breath hitching in my throat. This is a mistake. Some kind of administrative error." "There is no error," Julian replied, his eyes cold, reflecting the dim light of the lounge. "Arthur isn't your grandfather, Elena. He never was." "And the man who actually was? He's the one they erased from the history books 40 years ago." The ballroom music filtered through the walls, muffled and mocking. Outside, they were singing happy birthday to a man who had stolen my life before I was even born. "Who is he?" I whispered, the words tasting like ash. Julian didn't answer immediately. He walked to the window, staring out at the manicured gardens of the estate. "That," he said, turning back to me with a smile that didn't touch his eyes, "is the question that will either save us or burn this house to the ground." The door handle rattled. A servant was trying to enter. Julian moved toward me, his silhouette looming large in the dim light, and for the first time, I realized I was trapped in a room with a man I suddenly knew I had never truly seen. Chapter 2, The Archive of Whispers. The silence in the lounge was heavier than the marble pillars holding up the ballroom. Julian stood by the window, his posture too perfect, his shadow stretching across the floor like an ink stain. "Julian," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "You've had this for weeks. Why now? Why at the 100th birthday toast?" He turned, a dry, mirthless chuckle escaping his lips. "Timing is everything in architecture, Elena. You don't bring down a skyscraper by kicking the foundation from the roof. You need the whole structure to be vibrating with its own self-importance." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I shoved the DNA report into my clutch, my movements mechanical. I needed to see Aunt Beatrice. If anyone knew the cracks in the sterling foundation, it was the woman who had spent 30 years drinking martinis and recording every secret whispered in the powder rooms of the East Coast. I stepped out of the lounge, my heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood. The ballroom was a sea of black ties and silk dresses. I spotted Beatrice near the buffet, delicately picking at a piece of smoked salmon as if it were an offensive gesture. "Elena, darling," she cooed, her eyes scanning me with the precision of a hawk. "You look pale. Did Julian bore you with his talk of structural integrity again? Men and their obsession with things that won't fall down." I leaned in, my voice lowered to a conspiratorial hum. "Beatrice, I need to know about 1926. About the vault records." Beatrice's hand froze midair. The mask she wore, the one sculpted by decades of galas, cracked, just for a millisecond. She took a slow sip of her martini, the ice clinking against the glass with a sound like shattering teeth. 1926, she repeated, her tone dripping with mock nostalgia. A year of bad fashion and worse investments. "Why on earth would you be digging in the trash, Elena?" "Because the trash is starting to smell," I retorted, letting a sliver of my genuine anger bleed through. "The DNA markers, Beatrice. They don't match." She leaned closer, the scent of expensive perfume and gin enveloping me. "Oh, honey," she whispered, her voice sharp as a razor. "You think you're the first one to doubt the bloodline? The Sterlings don't inherit power, we steal it, we curate it, and then we pretend it was always ours. If you found the truth, keep it tucked away. Because the moment you let it out, you stop being a princess and start being a liability." "A liability to who?" "To the person holding the key, darling." She gestured toward the far end of the room, where Arthur sat, laughing at a joke whispered by a senator. "And look around. Your husband isn't just standing guard. He's counting his chips." I turned, scanning the crowd. Julian was indeed talking to the estate lawyer, his hand resting too firmly on the man's shoulder. He wasn't guarding me, he was positioning himself for the fallout. The absurdity of it all hit me with a jolt of dark humor. Here we were, in a room full of the most powerful people in the country, all celebrating a man whose entire legacy was a forgery, while I, the supposed heiress, was just a blank page waiting to be written over. I pulled out my moleskine notebook and scribbled a name I'd found on the back of the DNA report, Marcus Thorne. "Who is he, Beatrice?" I pressed, ignoring her warning. "He was the man who actually owned the land this estate sits on," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that sounded like dry leaves skittering on concrete. "Before the accident in the archives. Be careful, Elena. You're playing with a ghost." She drifted away, leaving me alone in the center of the glittering, hollow crowd. I stood there, a ghost in my own life, clutching a secret that felt like a ticking bomb. Julian approached, his smile wide and artificial. "Time for the toast, Elena," he whispered, offering his arm. "Let's give them a performance they'll never forget." Chapter 3, The Ghost in the Archive. The microphone screeched, a jagged, feedback-heavy sound that sliced through the ballroom chatter like a serrated knife. Arthur Sterling stood at the mahogany podium, his thin, translucent hands gripping the sides as if they were the only things keeping him anchored to this earth. 100 years, his voice crackled through the speakers, magnified into a hollow, booming caricature of authority. A century of building. A century of legacy. And here stands my granddaughter, the future of the Sterling name. He gestured toward me. Every eye in the room turned. The glint of 1,000 diamonds and the artificial warmth of the spotlights felt like a furnace. I stood beside Julian, who gave my hand a sharp, painful squeeze. It wasn't a gesture of comfort, it was a command to stay silent. "Tell them, Elena," Julian whispered, his lips barely moving. "Tell them about your heritage. I felt the DNA report burning in my clutch. The irony was suffocating. I stepped forward, not toward the podium, but toward the center of the floor. I grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and tapped it against the crystal flute in my other hand. The sound was clear, sharp, and entirely out of place. "Legacy," I repeated, my voice steady, fueled by a sudden, icy clarity. We've spent the last hour toasting to a legacy of construction. But what about the demolition, grandfather? The room went deathly silent. A waiter dropped a tray of hors d'oeuvres, the clatter was deafening. Arthur's face turned the color of aged parchment, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure, crystalline malice. Elena, sit down, he warned, his voice low but cutting through the silence. You've had too much to drink. I haven't had enough, I replied, walking toward the dais. I've been reading. I've been looking at the archives. Not the ones you show the public, but the ones buried in the basement under the foundation of this very ballroom. I reached the podium and pulled out the report. I didn't care about the cameras, or the senator, or the hushed gasps of the elite. I laid the document on the wood, right over his prepared speech. My name is Elena. But the DNA markers don't belong to the Sterling line. They trace back to a name that was erased from the property deeds in 1926. Marcus Thorne. I looked directly at Arthur, whose grip on the podium had turned white-knuckled. You didn't build this estate, did you? You just occupied the scene of the crime. The reaction was instantaneous. A murmur rose, then swelled into a roar of confusion. Beatrice stood in the corner, a feline smirk playing on her lips, her drink held perfectly still. You foolish girl, Arthur hissed, leaning into the microphone, forgetting to switch it off. His voice boomed across the room, shaky and furious. You think a piece of paper destroys a century of power? This family is the law. We don't just own the land, we define it. Without me, you are nothing but a common thief's descendant. If I'm a thief's descendant, then you're the one who taught me how to steal, I countered, my voice echoing back at me. Suddenly, Julian stepped in. I expected him to defend me, but he moved toward the microphone, his face a mask of calculated regret. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, his voice smooth as oil. It seems the stress of the event has caused my wife to suffer a mental breakdown. Please, continue the evening. Security will handle the rest. He looked at me, his eyes devoid of any warmth, and I realized then that the mask had fallen for both of us. He hadn't given me the report to help me. He had given it to me so I would be the one to self-destruct, clearing the path for him to take control of the family assets that were suddenly, legally, in question. The ballroom descended into chaos, the sound of shouting and shattering glass drowning out the jazz trio. I stood there, amidst the wreckage of a century-old lie, realizing that the house was indeed burning, and Julian was holding the match. Chapter 4, The Architecture of a Fall. The security guards moved in with the mechanical grace of men who were paid to ignore their own morals. I was escorted to the library, a room walled in leather-bound volumes that smelled of dust and unearned privilege. Julian followed, his hand still gripping my arm, his face a chilling landscape of practiced concern. You really shouldn't have done that, Elena, he sighed, pacing the room. He didn't lock the door, he didn't need to. He knew I had nowhere to run. You've made yourself a liability. The board members are already discussing how to handle the Sterling scandal without the stock price plummeting. You've handed me the leverage I needed to consolidate the assets. It's almost a shame. I sat in the high-backed wing chair, my pulse drumming against my wrists. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the fragility of his plan. He was a man building a cathedral on sand. You think you've won, Julian, I said, my voice steady, stripped of the trembling from earlier. You think that by framing me as unstable, you can step into Arthur's shoes. But you forgot one detail. You didn't just give me the DNA report. You gave me the bank statements attached to the back of it. Julian stopped pacing. His back stiffened. I spent the last hour in the hallway, I continued, not panicking, but reading the footnotes. Those aren't just archives. Those are records of offshore transfers. Julian, you've been siphoning the family trust to cover your architectural firm's bankruptcy for 3 years. You're not just a husband, you're an embezzler. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The silence was absolute. You're bluffing, he spat, turning to face me. The mask of the doting husband was gone, replaced by the desperate, sharp-edged reality of a man losing everything. Am I? I reached into the hidden pocket of my gown and pulled out a small, encrypted drive, the one I'd swiped from the study while he was distracted by his conversation with the lawyer. Arthur didn't build this empire alone, but he did keep records of every partner who crossed him. And you, my dear Julian, have been the most predictable partner he ever had. He lunged for the desk, his composure shattering like glass. He wasn't the polished socialite anymore, he was a trapped animal. Give that to me. The moment the police arrive, I said, keeping my voice low and dangerous. I've already contacted the SEC investigators via the encrypted link on the tablet in the foyer. They'll be here in 20 minutes. Not for a mental breakdown, but for a financial audit. The realization hit him. He reached for the phone, but the line was dead. I had cut it hours ago, back when I was still playing the perfect wife. You did all of this, he whispered, his eyes widening. You used the birthday to trap me. I learned from the best, I said, looking toward the door. Arthur taught me that legacy is a lie, and you taught me that greed is a trap. I'm just the one who's closing the door. He started toward me, his hands outstretched, his face twisted in a mask of primal rage. But just as he reached me, the distant, rhythmic wail of sirens began to pierce the quiet night air of the estate. The trap had closed. The isolation was complete. Julian was no longer the architect of my life, he was merely the latest piece of rubble in the foundation I was finally tearing down. Chapter 5, The Last Echo of the Chimes. The blue and red lights of the police cruisers danced against the tall windows of the library, turning the room into a kaleidoscope of disaster. Julian stood frozen, his hands still hovering in the air as if he were trying to grasp a reality that had already dissolved. The heavy mahogany door swung open. It wasn't the police who entered first, but Arthur, followed by a phalanx of silent, stone-faced attorneys. He looked older than he had in the ballroom, the lights didn't soften his face, they carved deep, jagged canyons into his skin. It's over, Elena, Arthur said, his voice barely a rasp. He didn't look at Julian. To him, Julian was a failed experiment, a tool that had snapped in his hand. You've destroyed the evening. You've destroyed the family brand. Do you have any idea what you've done? I've done what you never could, I replied, standing up to face him. I've stopped the clock. I tossed the encrypted drive onto the table between us. It slid across the polished wood, stopping inches from his hand. The SEC is already in the driveway. And they aren't just here for Julian's embezzling. They're here for the 1926 property titles. The ones that prove you never owned this land. The ones that prove you murdered Marcus Thorne to seize it. Arthur's eyes darted to the drive. For a heartbeat, the man of granite flickered. He laughed, a thin, wheezing sound that held no mirth. And you think you survived this? If I go down, the foundation of your own life goes with me. Every cent you've ever spent, every privilege you've ever enjoyed, it all comes from that crime. I know, I said. I walked to the window, watching as the federal agents began to stream toward the front entrance. I'm not looking for a rescue, Arthur. I'm looking for an exit. Julian let out a hollow, broken sound. He turned to Arthur, his face slick with sweat. Arthur, please. I did exactly what you asked for. I kept her focused on the archives. Arthur didn't even blink. You were always replaceable, Julian. That was your greatest flaw. The agents burst into the library. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and impending finality. I watched them handcuff Julian, the man who had planned to trade me for his debts, and lead him out, his protests drowned out by the heavy clatter of boots on marble. Arthur Sterling, the king of a century-long forgery, was left sitting in the armchair I had vacated. He looked at me, a flicker of something almost like pride crossing his eyes, before his face hardened back into a mask of cold calculation. He knew how to play this game, he would fight them, he would bury them in motions, but the myth of the Sterling legacy had been pierced. It would never heal. I walked out of the library, past the shattered remains of the ballroom, and out into the cool, biting air of the estate grounds. The party was over. The music had stopped, replaced by the chaotic hum of a scandal that would dominate the news cycle for months. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my moleskine notebook. I didn't need it anymore. I dropped it into the fountain, watching the ink bleed into the water until the pages were nothing but blank, sodden paper. I didn't have a name anymore, not really. I didn't have a family, or a fortune, or a husband. I stood at the gates of the Sterling estate, listening to the silence of the night. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I began to walk, my heels clicking on the pavement, until the sound of the house of 100 years of lies, faded into nothingness. I was finally, truly, alone. And for the first time in my life, that was enough.